February 8th, 1991, Failaka Island, Kuwait. An Iraqi soldier looked up at the buzzing mechanical birds circling overhead. For 3 days the rumble had been growing louder, the earth-shaking thunder of 16-inch naval rifles firing from somewhere beyond the horizon. Now this strange aircraft, clearly unmanned, hovered above the entrenched positions like a predatory hawk. The soldier raised a white cloth tied to his rifle. Around him, others did the same. Through the Pioneer drone's camera lens, operators aboard the USS Wisconsin witnessed history. Iraqi troops were surrendering to a robot. It was the first time in recorded military history that enemy forces had capitulated to an unmanned vehicle. But the drone wasn't what terrified them. It was what the drone represented. Somewhere out in the Persian Gulf, invisible beyond the curvature of the Earth, sat a floating fortress capable of hurling 2,700-pound projectiles with devastating accuracy. The Iraqis had experienced that accuracy firsthand. For days, Wisconsin's 9 16-inch guns had systematically demolished every fortified position, every command post, every artillery battery on the island. The bombardment was surgical, relentless, inescapable. Those massive shells didn't just explode, they erased. Bunkers that had withstood weeks of airstrikes vanished under the hammer blows of naval artillery. The psychological impact was total. When Iraqi soldiers saw the Pioneer overhead, they knew what was coming next. Surrender wasn't cowardice, it was survival. This moment crystallized a question that naval strategists had debated for half a century. In an age of missiles, jets, and electronics, could battleships still matter? The answer arrived in a cloud of cordite and crushed concrete. Welcome to the story of how the Iowa-class battleships, declared obsolete by history, proved they were anything but. This is the day the battleships showed the world they still had teeth. The story begins not in the Persian Gulf, but in the final desperate months of World War II. By 1944, the aircraft carrier had definitively replaced the battleship as the queen of naval warfare. The age of the gun had ended. The age of the airplane had begun. Everyone knew it. The Japanese knew it after losing 4 carriers at Midway. The Americans knew it after their carriers savaged the Japanese fleet at Philippine Sea. Even the battleship admirals raised on Mahan's doctrines of decisive surface action could read the writing on the bulkhead. Yet in June 1940, even before Pearl Harbor proved the carrier's dominance, the United States Navy ordered construction of 6 Iowa-class battleships. The timing seems paradoxical. Why build battleships when carriers were clearly the future? The answer reveals a fundamental truth about naval warfare. Flexibility matters more than specialization. The Iowa class wasn't designed to fight other battleships in Jutland-style slugfests. Those days were already fading into nostalgia. Instead, these ships were designed to operate with carrier task forces, to keep pace with the fast carriers, to provide anti-aircraft defense with their formidable secondary batteries, to shore bombard in support of amphibious operations, and if necessary, to engage enemy surface units that slipped through the air umbrella. 4 ships were completed: Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. 2 more, Illinois and Kentucky, were laid down but never finished. The Montana class, even larger battleships mounting 12 16-inch guns, were cancelled before their keels were laid. The Essex-class carriers took priority. The Iowa class represented the pinnacle of American battleship design. 887 feet long, 57,000 tons fully loaded, capable of 33 knots, faster than any previous American battleship. This speed was crucial. It allowed them to operate as integral members of the fast carrier task forces that would dominate the Pacific War. Their main battery consisted of 9 16-inch 50 caliber Mark 7 guns, arranged in 3 triple turrets. These weapons could hurl armor-piercing shells weighing 2,700 pounds over 23 miles. Each gun was individually sleeved, meaning if one tube wore out, it could be replaced without removing the entire gun assembly. The secondary battery featured 25-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in 10 twin mounts. These versatile weapons could engage surface targets at ranges exceeding 9 miles, or serve as anti-aircraft artillery. The fire control systems directing these weapons represented the cutting edge of 1940s technology. Radar-assisted range-finding, mechanical computers calculating solutions, gyro-stabilized directors compensating for the ship's motion. Protection was extensive, though not impenetrable. The armour belt measured 12.1 inches at its thickest. The main turret faces were 17 inches. The conning tower had 17.3 inches. The armoured deck consisted of multiple layers totalling 6 inches. This protection scheme could theoretically withstand hits from their own 16-inch guns at most battle ranges. Theoretically. The 4 completed Iowa-class ships saw extensive service in the Pacific Theatre. They screened carriers. They bombarded Japanese positions on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the home islands. They provided anti-aircraft defense against kamikaze attacks. Missouri achieved immortality on September 2, 1945, when representatives of Imperial Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender on her teak deck in Tokyo Bay. But their combat record, while honourable, was not particularly distinguished. They never engaged another battleship in surface action. The climactic gunnery duel the old battleship admirals dreamed about never materialised. Their anti-aircraft batteries shot down Japanese planes, but so did dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Their shore bombardments were effective but hardly revolutionary. As World War II ended, the writing seemed clear. Battleships were museum pieces, relics of a bygone age. The Navy began an aggressive decommissioning program. By 1949, Iowa, New Jersey, and Wisconsin had been mothballed. Missouri remained in service slightly longer before joining her sisters in reserve. The age of the battleship was over, except it wasn't. June 25th, 1950. North Korean forces crashed across the 38th parallel, igniting the Korean War. The invasion caught American forces unprepared. US ground troops in Japan were occupation soldiers, not combat units. Equipment was obsolete. Training was minimal. Within days, North Korean armour was driving South Korean and American forces into a shrinking perimeter around Pusan. The Navy responded with everything available. Carriers launched airstrikes. Cruisers and destroyers provided gunfire support. But the demand for naval artillery exceeded supply. The 5-inch guns on destroyers and 8-inch guns on cruisers were effective, but there simply weren't enough of them. The Marines, fighting desperate defensive actions around the Pusan perimeter, needed heavier fire support. Someone at the Navy Department looked at the mothball fleet and had an idea. The Iowa-class battleships sat in reserve, maintained in preservative wrapping, their machinery pickled against corrosion. They could be reactivated. Missouri was the first to return, recommissioned in January 1951. New Jersey followed in November 1951. Iowa came back in August 1951. Wisconsin joined in March 1952. The modifications were minimal. Helicopters replaced the obsolete float planes. Updated radar and electronics were installed. Otherwise, the ships returned to service essentially as they had been in 1945. What followed proved that battleships could still contribute to modern warfare, even if the nature of that contribution had changed. The 16-inch guns that had been designed to sink enemy battleships found a new purpose: shore bombardment, fire support for ground troops, destruction of enemy infrastructure, and they excelled at it. March 15, 1952. The USS Wisconsin steamed slowly along the North Korean coast near Songjin. Her mission was simple: destroy the railroad infrastructure supplying enemy forces at the front. The railroad ran along the coast, threading through tunnels blasted into the mountainside. North Korean supply trains used these tunnels constantly, moving south under cover of darkness. Destroying the tunnels would sever this supply line. But how do you destroy a tunnel? Airstrikes had limited effectiveness. A bomb might collapse the entrance, but sappers could clear it in hours. What you needed was sustained, precise bombardment that would bring down the entire mountain. Wisconsin's 16-inch guns provided the answer. The battleship took station 3 miles offshore. Her fire control radars locked onto the coordinates. Her Mark 38 directors calculated solutions. Then she fired. 9 16-inch shells, each weighing as much as a compact car, arced through the air. They struck within seconds of each other, bracketing the tunnel entrance. The mountain shook. Rock and debris fountained into the air. Wisconsin adjusted her aim, fired again and again. The bombardment continued for 20 minutes. Observers ashore watched in awe as the sustained firing literally brought down the mountain. The tunnel didn't just collapse, it ceased to exist, buried under thousands of tons of rubble. No sappers were going to clear that debris. One supply line eliminated, but Wisconsin wasn't finished. She shifted fire to a second tunnel 4 miles north, then a third. By the end of the day, she had destroyed 4 major rail tunnels and damaged 2 others. The North Korean supply network along that section of coast was effectively severed. This wasn't the kind of mission battleships were designed for, but it was the kind of mission they were uniquely qualified to execute. No other weapon system could deliver that weight of fire with that precision for that duration. Aircraft could strike hard but couldn't loiter. Artillery might have the sustained fire but lacked the range. Only the battleships could combine all 3 qualities: power, precision, persistence. The Iowa-class ships conducted similar missions throughout the Korean War. They bombarded troop concentrations, destroyed command posts, leveled supply depots, provided fire support for amphibious operations. The statistics were impressive. During Iowa's 1952 deployment, she fired over 2,000 rounds of 16-inch ammunition and thousands of 5-inch shells. That's more ordnance than she had expended during her entire World War II service. Missouri fired 3,161 rounds of 16-inch ammunition during her Korean deployments. Wisconsin and New Jersey added thousands more. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. North Korean and Chinese soldiers learned to fear the battleship bombardments. The distinctive whistle of incoming 16-inch shells became a terror. When a battleship was offshore, enemy troops knew their bunkers, their tunnels, their fortifications offered no real protection. One Chinese officer, captured after a bombardment, told his interrogators that his unit had withstood weeks of airstrikes without breaking. But after 3 days of battleship fire, half his men had deserted. The shells didn't just wound or kill, they obliterated. A direct hit from a 16-inch projectile left nothing recognizable. The concussion alone could kill men in nearby bunkers. The psychological effect was devastating. Yet even as the Iowa class proved their worth in Korea, critics argued this was merely a reprieve, a temporary usefulness in a limited war. The future still belonged to carriers, missiles and jets. Once the Korean War ended, the battleships would return to mothballs, and they did. By 1958, all 4 were back in reserve. This time, it seemed permanent. The 1960s and 1970s were dark decades for battleship advocates. The ships sat rusting at their moorings. Occasionally someone proposed reactivating them. The Marines wanted gunfire support for amphibious operations. Some strategists suggested converting them to missile platforms, but nothing came of these proposals. The ships were too old, too expensive to operate, too crew-intensive. New Jersey briefly returned to service in 1968 for Vietnam War operations, conducting shore bombardments along the coast. But this was clearly a temporary measure. She was decommissioned again in 1969. The consensus seemed clear. The battleship era was definitively over. Then, in the late 1970s, the strategic situation shifted. The Soviet Union launched an aggressive naval expansion. New classes of surface combatants appeared: guided missile cruisers, missile-armed destroyers, and most significantly, the Kirov-class battlecruisers. The Kirov class were nuclear-powered monsters displacing 28,000 tons. They bristled with anti-ship missiles, surface-to-air missiles, torpedoes, guns, and helicopters. They represented the most powerful surface combatants built by any navy since World War II. The United States Navy studied the Kirovs and realized they had a problem. American destroyers and cruisers, designed primarily for anti-submarine and air defense missions, were not optimized for surface warfare against heavily armed opponents. The Kirovs could potentially wreak havoc on American carrier battle groups if they got within missile range. The Navy needed a counter, something with the firepower to engage Kirovs at long range, something with the armor to absorb hits, something that could serve as the centerpiece of a surface action group. Someone looked at the Iowa-class battleship sitting in mothballs and said, what if? Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign promised to rebuild American military strength. Part of that promise was a 600-ship navy, up from the approximately 500 ships in service. Building new ships takes time, years to design, years to construct. But reactivating existing ships could be done much faster. Secretary of the Navy John Lehman championed the battleship reactivation. His vision was straightforward. The Iowa class would become the centerpieces of surface action groups, independent striking forces capable of projecting power without relying on carrier support. But to make this work, the ships needed modernization. The obsolete World War II electronics had to be replaced. The anti-aircraft guns were useless against modern jets and needed removal. Most importantly, the ships needed modern weapons, missiles, not just for defense, but for offense. The modernization program was ambitious. Engineers removed the majority of the 5-inch gun mounts to make space for missile systems. In their place went armored box launchers, housing 32 BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Mark 141 quad launchers were installed for 16 RGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles. 4 Phalanx close-in weapon systems provided last-ditch defense against incoming missiles and aircraft. The electronics suite was completely overhauled. New radars, updated fire control systems, modern communications equipment, satellite navigation. The ships received helicopter decks aft, though they had no hangars. Most intriguingly, they received RQ-2 Pioneer drones, remotely piloted vehicles that could spot for the guns and conduct reconnaissance. The 16-inch main battery remained, of course. Those 9 massive guns were still the most powerful naval artillery in the world, but now they would be guided by drone-spotted targeting, precision guided by remote eyes. The transformation cost approximately $1.7 billion for all 4 ships, roughly $425 million each. By comparison, a new Aegis cruiser cost around $1 billion. A new carrier exceeded $3 billion. The economics were compelling. For less than the cost of 2 cruisers, the Navy was getting 4 heavily armed capital ships. Iowa recommissioned in April 1984. New Jersey followed in December 1982. Missouri came back in May 1986. Wisconsin returned in October 1988. The battleships were back. Critics abounded. Some argued the money would be better spent on new construction. Others pointed out that each battleship required a crew of 1,500, enough to man multiple smaller vessels. Still others noted the ship's vulnerability to modern anti-ship missiles. But supporters countered with practical arguments. The visible presence of battleships had psychological and diplomatic value. Their 16-inch guns provided a capability no other ship possessed. The combination of guns and missiles made them versatile, and they were available now, not 10 years in the future. The debate became moot when the battleships went to work. September 24th, 1983. Lebanon. The USS New Jersey, the first of the Iowa class to recommission, under the modernization program, lay offshore near Beirut. Lebanon was descending into chaos. Multiple factions fought in a bewildering civil war. US Marines were deployed as part of a multinational peacekeeping force. They were taking casualties. On this morning, New Jersey received fire support requests from Marine positions ashore. Hostile artillery in the mountains was shelling the Marine compound. The battleship prepared to respond. Her 16-inch guns trained toward the mountains. Fire control calculated solutions. Then she fired. The sound was apocalyptic. The concussion rippled across the water. The projectiles screamed inland. 60 seconds later, the hostile artillery position ceased to exist. One Marine officer watching from shore later reported it was like God's fist reaching down and smiting the enemy. The artillery battery, its guns, its ammunition, its crew simply vanished in a crater 40 feet across. New Jersey conducted several such fire missions during her Lebanon deployment. The presence of her 16-inch guns gave planners options they hadn't possessed before. Long-range fire support without risking aircraft, precision destruction of hardened targets, sustained bombardment capability. The Lebanon operations were controversial. Some argued the battleship's involvement was counterproductive, antagonizing local factions. Others questioned whether the targets justified using a capital ship. But operationally, New Jersey proved the concept. Battleships could contribute to modern conflicts. Their guns still had utility. Their presence still mattered. The real test came in the Persian Gulf. August 2nd, 1990. Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein's military, battle-hardened from 8 years of war with Iran, rolled south in overwhelming force. Kuwait fell in days. The international community responded with sanctions and ultimatums. When diplomacy failed, military force would follow. The United States began deploying forces to Saudi Arabia under Operation Desert Shield. The defensive phase would deter further Iraqi aggression. Eventually, Desert Shield would transition to Desert Storm, the offensive operation to liberate Kuwait. 2 Iowa-class battleships deployed to the Persian Gulf, Missouri and Wisconsin. Iowa and New Jersey were in various states of refit and could not participate. The two sisters that did deploy would write the final chapter in battleship combat history. Their mission combined their dual nature. The Tomahawk missiles would strike strategic targets deep in Iraq. The 16-inch guns would provide tactical fire support along the coast. Together, they would help convince Saddam Hussein's forces that resistance was futile. The Tomahawk strikes came first, January 17, 1991, 0140 hours. Wisconsin served as the Tomahawk Land Attack Missile Strike Commander for the Persian Gulf. Her Combat Information Center coordinated launches from multiple ships across the fleet. At precisely 0140, she gave the order, fire. Tomahawk missiles erupted from launchers across the fleet. Wisconsin herself launched 8. Missouri launched 7. Cruisers and destroyers added dozens more. The missiles flew north toward Baghdad and other strategic targets. Flying at 500 miles per hour, hugging the terrain, using GPS and terrain mapping guidance, they struck with devastating precision. Command and control bunkers, communications nodes, air defense headquarters. The opening salvo of Desert Storm was designed to blind and paralyze Iraqi command structure. It worked. Wisconsin would ultimately launch 24 Tomahawks during the war. Missouri launched 28. These cruise missiles provided standoff strike capability, allowing the battleships to hit targets over 300 miles inland. But the missiles were only half the story. The guns still had work to do. February 3, 1991. Missouri took station off the Kuwaiti coast. Her mission was shore bombardment in support of the coming ground offensive. But first, intelligence needed to know what Iraqi forces were positioned along the coast. The Pioneer drones launched from her aft deck. These remotely piloted vehicles flew reconnaissance missions over Iraqi positions, their cameras transmitting real-time video back to the ship. What the drones revealed confirmed intelligence estimates. Iraqi forces had heavily fortified the coastal areas, bunkers, artillery positions, troop concentrations. They expected an amphibious assault. In reality, no amphibious assault was planned. The ground offensive would come from the west, a massive left hook through the desert. But Iraqi commanders didn't know that, and the coalition planners wanted to keep them guessing. Missouri's bombardment served two purposes. First, to destroy actual targets that could threaten coalition forces. Second, to reinforce the deception that an amphibious assault was imminent. If the Iraqis believed Marines were coming ashore, they would keep forces on the coast, forces that wouldn't be available to counter the real attack. Missouri began her bombardment. The 16-inch guns spoke. Their thunder rolled across the water. The shells arced inland. Then came the impacts. Bunkers collapsed. Artillery positions exploded. The earth fountained upward. Each shell delivered devastating kinetic energy, over 2,700 pounds travelling at supersonic velocity. The explosions could be felt miles away. The psychological impact was even more profound than the physical destruction. February 6, 1991. Failaka Island, Kuwait. This small island commanded the approaches to Kuwait Bay. Iraqi forces had fortified it extensively. Bunkers, trenches, minefields, artillery. Taking the island would be a bloody affair if done conventionally. Missouri was assigned to soften it up. What followed was one of the most comprehensive shore bombardments since World War II. Missouri fired 133 16-inch shells at targets across the island. The bombardment was methodical, surgical. The Pioneer drones overhead spotted targets and assessed damage. Fire control adjusted aim. The guns fired. Explosions walked across the island like a giant's footsteps. Every bunker, every artillery position, every command post, systematically destroyed, one by one. The Iraqis on Failaka had no answer. They couldn't shoot back at a target 3 miles offshore. Their artillery lacked the range. They couldn't flee. There was nowhere to go. They could only huddle in their bunkers and hope. But the bunkers offered no real protection, not against shells designed to penetrate battleship armour. The 16-inch projectiles punched through reinforced concrete like it was cardboard. The bombardment continued for days. Missouri would fire, withdraw, return, fire again. Wisconsin joined in. Between them, they systematically dismantled every significant defensive position on the island. Then came the moment captured by the Pioneer's camera. The white flags, the surrenders, Iraqi soldiers, shell-shocked and demoralized, giving up to a drone. They had no idea if Marines were about to land. They didn't care. Anything was better than more of that bombardment. The battle for Falaka Island was over before it began. Missouri and Wisconsin had rendered conventional assault unnecessary. The psychological victory was as significant as the tactical one. Not every mission went smoothly. On February 25, 1991, Missouri was conducting fire support missions when Iraqi forces launched a counterstrike. 2 HY-2 Silkworm anti-ship missiles, Chinese-made weapons with a range of 50 miles streaked toward the battleship. These were serious threats. Each Silkworm carried a 1,100-pound warhead travelling at just under the speed of sound. A hit could cause serious damage even to an armoured battleship. Missouri's escorts reacted immediately. The British destroyer HMS Gloucester detected the missiles on radar. She fired 2 Sea Dart surface-to-air missiles. 1 Sea Dart intercepted a Silkworm, destroying it in mid-air. This was the first time in naval history that a surface-to-air missile had successfully engaged and destroyed an enemy anti-ship missile in combat. A milestone moment in naval warfare. The second Silkworm approached Missouri. The battleship launched chaff, clouds of metal foil designed to confuse radar-guided missiles. The chaff worked. The Silkworm's guidance locked onto the false target. It missed Missouri by 700 feet, splashing harmlessly into the Gulf. Missouri responded with her 16-inch guns. Her fire control calculated the back azimuth to the Silkworm launch site. She trained her guns. She fired. The launch site, its missiles, its radars, its crew, ceased to exist, buried under a salvo of 16-inch shells. The exchange demonstrated both the battleship's vulnerability and its resilience. Yes, modern missiles could threaten them, but their escorts could defend them. Their armour could absorb damage, and their guns could retaliate with overwhelming force. There was a friendly fire incident as well. On February 25th, the same day as the Silkworm attack, an Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate, USS Jarrett, mistook Missouri's defensive chaff for an actual threat. Jarrett's phalanx close-in weapon system, designed to automatically engage incoming missiles, locked onto the chaff. It fired. 20mm rounds from the phalanx stitched across Missouri's stern. Most ricocheted harmlessly off the armour. One penetrated a bulkhead and embedded in an interior passageway. One sailor suffered minor injuries from flying debris. The incident was embarrassing, but not serious. It also demonstrated why the Iowa class still had relevance. Any modern warship hit by phalanx fire would have suffered significant damage. Missouri's World War II-era armour, designed to withstand 16-inch shells, shrugged off 20mm rounds like raindrops. By the time the ground war ended on February 28, 1991, Missouri had fired 783 rounds of 16-inch ammunition. Wisconsin had fired 319 rounds. Together, they had launched 52 Tomahawk missiles. The combination of modern missiles and traditional guns proved devastatingly effective. Iraqi forces that surrendered to coalition troops reported that the battleship bombardments had been among the most terrifying experiences of the war. Some Iraqi units suffered 50% desertion rates after enduring the shelling. The Gulf War represented the last time battleships engaged in combat. It was a fitting finale. They had demonstrated that even in an age of precision-guided munitions, stealth technology and electronic warfare, there was still room for heavy naval artillery. The 16-inch guns could do things missiles couldn't. They provided sustained fire support for hours if necessary. They were unaffected by electronic countermeasures. They were cheaper per round than cruise missiles, and they had an intimidation factor that missiles lacked. When a battleship fired, everyone for miles around knew it. The thunder. The flash. The impact. There was nothing subtle about it. That psychological impact mattered. But the Gulf War also revealed the battleship's limitations. They were crew-intensive. Each ship required about 1,500 sailors. By comparison, an Aegis cruiser needed only 400. They were expensive to maintain. The steam propulsion plants were 1940s technology. Finding sailors trained on them was difficult. They were vulnerable to modern anti-ship missiles. The armour could withstand them, probably, but probably wasn't good enough in modern warfare. Most significantly, their primary weapon system was becoming obsolete. The 16-inch guns were magnificent, but precision-guided munitions could achieve similar effects with much smaller weapons. Why use a 2,700-pound dumb shell when a 500-pound GPS-guided bomb could hit the same target? The answer was that sometimes you needed the 2,700-pound shell, sometimes nothing else would do. But those situations were becoming rarer. The Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991. The Kirov-class battlecruisers, the original justification for reactivating the Iowa class, were laid up or scrapped. The strategic rationale for maintaining battleships evaporated. The Navy, facing budget constraints, looked for places to cut costs. Battleships were expensive. They required large crews. They needed specialized maintenance. The powder for the 16-inch guns was becoming problematic. Much of it had been manufactured in the 1930s and 1940s. It was deteriorating. Producing new powder would be expensive. The Navy began decommissioning the battleships. Iowa was the first to go in October 1990, even before the Gulf War ended. New Jersey followed in February 1991. Missouri, the most famous of the class, decommissioned in March 1992. Wisconsin, the last active battleship in the US Navy and the world, decommissioned in September 1991. This time it really was over. Congress initially required that 2 battleships be maintained in ready reserve, theoretically capable of reactivation. New Jersey and Wisconsin were selected. But maintaining ships in ready reserve is expensive. As the years passed and the strategic situation changed, even this requirement faded. In 2006, Iowa and Wisconsin were finally struck from the Naval Vessel Register, officially ending any possibility of return to service. All 4 ships became museum ships: Iowa in Los Angeles, New Jersey in Camden, New Jersey, Missouri at Pearl Harbor, berthed near the USS Arizona Memorial. Wisconsin in Norfolk, Virginia. Today, you can walk their decks, touch their guns, and stand where history was made. So what's the final verdict? Did the Iowa-class battleships prove they still mattered? The answer is complicated. In the pure naval sense, no. Aircraft carriers definitively replaced battleships as the capital ships of modern navies. The Iowa class never fought the decisive surface action their designers envisioned. They never engaged enemy battleships. They never dominated sea lanes through gunfire alone. But in a broader sense, yes. They proved that flexibility and versatility matter more than narrow specialization. They served in 4 wars across 5 decades: World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. No other class of American warship can make that claim. They demonstrated that old platforms can be modernized and given new life. The 1980s refits transformed them from World War II relics into multi-role platforms capable of launching cruise missiles and providing fire support. They showed that sometimes brute force still has a place. Precision-guided munitions are wonderful, but sometimes you need a 2,700-pound shell to make an impression. They provided capabilities no other ship possessed. The 16-inch guns gave theatre commanders options they otherwise wouldn't have had. Most importantly, they proved that presence matters. When an Iowa-class battleship appeared offshore, everyone noticed. Enemies, allies, neutral observers. The battleships were floating symbols of American power and resolve. The debate over naval gunfire support continues today. The Navy is developing new ships and weapons to fill the role the battleships once played. The Zumwalt-class destroyers were supposed to provide advanced naval gunfire with their long-range guns, but the ammunition proved prohibitively expensive. The Marine Corps desperately wants effective fire support for amphibious operations. Precision missiles are effective but expensive. You can't sustain hours of fire support with cruise missiles at over $1 million each. Some veterans argue the Iowa class should never have been retired, that the Navy threw away a unique capability. Others insist that maintaining 50-year-old steam-powered behemoths made no sense when modern technology could provide equivalent effects more efficiently. Both sides have valid points. What's undeniable is that the Iowa class, built for a war that never came, proved adaptable enough to serve in conflicts their designers never imagined. They were designed to fight enemy battleships in conventional surface actions. Instead, they provided fire support in limited wars, launched cruise missiles at strategic targets, and intimidated regional powers. They adapted, they survived, they mattered. The last time a 16-inch gun fired in anger was February 1991. Wisconsin engaged in shore bombardment off Kuwait. The shell weighed 2,700 pounds. It travelled 20 miles. It struck a target with the force of a small meteorite. When the smoke cleared, the target no longer existed. That shot represented the end of an era, the final punctuation mark on a century of naval artillery development. From the 12-inch guns of the first dreadnoughts to the 16-inch rifles of the Iowa class, big guns had ruled the seas, but everything ends. The era of the battleship gun was over. Not because the guns failed, they worked perfectly, but because the world had changed. Precision mattered more than power, range mattered more than armor, flexibility mattered more than specialization. The Iowa-class battleships had proven they could adapt to changing circumstances, but there were limits to adaptation. Eventually, even the most flexible platform becomes outdated, yet their legacy endures. In museums, yes, where millions of visitors walk their decks each year, but also in doctrine and strategy. The lessons learned from deploying the Iowa class in the 1980s and 1990s informed naval thinking, the importance of shore bombardment, the value of visible presence, the need for sustained fire support. These lessons shaped future ship designs and tactical concepts, and perhaps most importantly, the Iowa class demonstrated something fundamental about naval power: that the old and the new can coexist, that innovation doesn't require abandoning proven platforms, that sometimes the best answer to a modern problem is an old solution with new technology. When Wisconsin's Pioneer drone spotted for her 16-inch guns in 1991, it symbolized this hybrid approach: cutting-edge robotics guiding World War II artillery, the future and the past working together. That's the real story of how the Iowa class proved they still mattered, not by fighting the war they were designed for, but by adapting to fight the wars that actually came, not by dominating the seas through brute force, but by providing unique capabilities when and where they were needed, not by turning back the clock to the battleship era, but by bringing battleship qualities forward into the modern age. The day the Iowa class proved they still mattered wasn't a single day. It was many days. April 1952, when Iowa's guns destroyed North Korean rail tunnels. September 1983, when New Jersey provided fire support in Lebanon. January 1991, when Wisconsin launched Tomahawks into Baghdad. February 1991, when Missouri's bombardment forced Iraqi troops to surrender to a drone. Each of these days demonstrated that even in an age of high technology, there's still room for heavy metal, that even in an age of precision, there's value in overwhelming firepower, that even in an age of long-range missiles, there are missions that require the sustained thunder of big guns. The Iowa-class battleships didn't change history. They weren't war-winning weapons. They didn't revolutionize naval warfare. But they mattered. They made a difference. They proved that written-off relics could still contribute. That's their legacy. Not as the dominant weapons they were designed to be, but as flexible tools that found new purposes in changing times. When the last Iowa-class battleship fired her last shot, an era truly ended. There will never be another battleship. The technological and strategic circumstances that made them viable are gone forever. Modern anti-ship missiles, precision munitions, and submarine-launched weapons have made large gun-armed surface combatants obsolete. But for one final war, in one final conflict, the battleships proved their worth. They showed that even in the precision-guided age, there's still a place for the thunderous roar of 16-inch guns. They proved, one last time, that they still mattered. And in doing so, they earned their place in history not as anachronisms, but as adaptable platforms that served their nation across multiple generations of warfare. The last battleships. The last of their kind. But not, when it counted, obsolete. That's the story of the day the Iowa class proved they still mattered. Not through a single dramatic moment, but through decades of adaptation, modernization, and professional service. From World War II to the Gulf War, from escort duty to cruise missile platform, from carrier screening to shore bombardment, they proved that flexibility and capability matter more than age. The steel hulls may now be museums, but their legacy continues to influence naval thinking. Because sometimes, the old ways still work. Sometimes, proven platforms still have value. Sometimes, thunder still speaks louder than words. The Iowa-class battleships had the last word, and it was spoken in the language they understood best. The roar of big guns, the thunder of heavy metal, the authority of overwhelming firepower, one last time they mattered. And the world listened. The museums where these ships rest today tell only part of the story. Walk the decks of the USS New Jersey and Camden, and you can still smell the faint odour of oil and metal. Touch the breech of a 16-inch gun, and you're touching a weapon that fired in anger across 5 decades. Stand in the Fire Control Center, and you can imagine the controlled chaos of combat operations. But to understand what made the Iowa class truly significant, you need to look beyond the hardware. You need to understand the men who operated these ships and the doctrine that evolved around them. The crew requirements were staggering by modern standards. Each Iowa-class battleship required approximately 500 sailors in her 1980s configuration. By comparison, a modern Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operates with a crew of about 300. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser needs around 400. 3 Iowa-class battleships required as many sailors as 10 modern surface combatants. This wasn't inefficiency, it was necessity. The 16-inch guns alone required massive crews. Each turret needed over 70 men to operate. Powder handlers, shell loaders, gun captains, rammer men. The projectiles weighed 2,700 pounds each. They couldn't be man-handled. Each required careful mechanical handling. The powder bags, 6 per shot, had to be precisely positioned. The breech mechanisms required constant attention. The guns themselves needed maintenance after every firing. The engineering spaces were equally labour-intensive. 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers generated steam at 600 pounds per square inch and 850 degrees Fahrenheit. These weren't automated systems. They required constant monitoring by trained boiler technicians, water levels, steam pressure, fuel flow, combustion efficiency. Every parameter had to be watched continuously. The propulsion system consisted of 4 sets of geared turbines driving 4 propeller shafts. Each shaft turned a massive bronze propeller 17 feet in diameter. These systems required dedicated engineering crews working in hot, noisy spaces deep in the ship's hull. The damage control parties added more personnel requirements. The Iowa class were designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. That required extensive damage control capabilities, firefighting teams, flooding response parties, repair crews, medical personnel, all had to be trained and ready to respond instantly to battle damage. The 1980s modernization added new complications. The Tomahawk and Harpoon missile systems required specialized technicians. The electronic warfare suites needed trained operators. The computer systems demanded IT specialists. The Pioneer drones required remote pilots and maintenance crews. You couldn't just take a World War II battleship crew and expect them to operate 1980s technology. The Navy had to develop entirely new training pipelines. Sailors had to learn both the old systems and the new ones. A fire controlman needed to understand 1940s mechanical computers and 1980s digital systems. An operations specialist had to master both radar-directed gunfire and cruise missile targeting. This hybrid nature made the Iowa class uniquely challenging to man and operate. Yet the crews who served aboard them developed fierce pride in their ships. There was something visceral about serving on a battleship. The sheer scale, the overwhelming power, the historical legacy. Sailors on destroyers and cruisers had effective ships with important missions. But they didn't have 16-inch guns. They didn't walk decks where history had been made. They didn't feel the entire ship shudder when the main battery fired. Chief Gunner's mate Michael Carr served aboard Missouri during her 1991 Gulf War deployment. He later described the experience of firing the main battery. You can't really understand it until you've felt it. When those 16-inch guns fire, the entire ship moves. 900 feet of steel and machinery physically shift sideways from the recoil. The sound isn't just loud, it's felt, in your chest, in your bones. The blast pressure hits you like a physical force, and when you're in the turret actually loading and firing, it's controlled chaos. The projectile comes up from the magazine on a hoist, the powder bags follow, everything has to be timed perfectly. The rammers push the projectile into the breech, the powder follows, the breech closes, the gun captain checks his board, all safety's green, the firing key is turned. Then everything explodes, the gun recoils 4 feet, the breech opens automatically, burning powder residue vents, the barrel is swabbed, and the whole process starts again. In combat, we could fire 2 rounds per minute from each gun. That's 18 2,700-pound projectiles every minute, over 50 tons of ordnance. Nothing else afloat could match that sustained firepower. Nothing. The doctrine surrounding battleship employment evolved significantly from World War II to the Gulf War. In the Pacific War, battleships operated as fleet units within carrier task forces. Their primary role was anti-aircraft defense and occasional shore bombardment. They were supporting players. The carriers were the stars. In Korea, the doctrine shifted. Battleships operated independently or with small escorts. They prowled the coasts, hunting targets of opportunity and providing fire support on demand. They became roving artillery platforms, unshackled from fleet formations. The Vietnam deployment of New Jersey followed similar patterns: solo operations close to shore, fire support missions, then return to port. In the 1980s, the Surface Action Group concept emerged. The Iowa class would serve as the centerpiece of independent strike forces. Escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and frigates, they would operate forward, threatening Soviet surface forces and providing power projection. The SAG doctrine emphasized the battleship's combination of offensive and defensive capabilities. The Tomahawk missiles could strike targets hundreds of miles inland. The Harpoon missiles could engage surface targets at the horizon. The 16-inch guns could bombard coastal targets. The armor could absorb damage that would cripple lighter vessels. The escorts would provide anti-submarine and anti-air defense. Together, a surface action group could contest sea control, project power ashore, and survive in high-threat environments. The Gulf War employment combined elements of all previous doctrines. Missouri and Wisconsin operated with substantial escorts. They launched Tomahawk strikes as part of coordinated multi-platform attacks. They conducted independent shore bombardment missions. They adapted tactics in real time based on enemy responses. The Pioneer drones added a revolutionary capability. For the first time, battleship gunners could see exactly where their shells were landing in real time. Previous generations had relied on spotters ashore or in aircraft reporting via radio. The delays and communication challenges limited precision. The Pioneer eliminated those problems. The drone orbited over the target area, its camera transmitting continuous video. The fire control team could see Iraqi positions, calculate firing solutions, launch the shells, and watch the impacts. If adjustments were needed, they could be made immediately for the next salvo. This real-time feedback transformed 16-inch gunfire from area bombardment into precision strikes. Lieutenant Commander Robert Moore, the aerial reconnaissance officer aboard Wisconsin, coordinated Pioneer operations during the Gulf War. In his after-action report, he noted the dramatic improvement in first-shot accuracy. Before drones, naval gunfire was essentially statistical. You fired many rounds to ensure hitting the target. With Pioneer, we could hit targets with the first or second salvo. We destroyed an Iraqi patrol boat with 2 16-inch shells, 2 shots, 2 hits, a moving target on the water. That would have been nearly impossible without real-time visual feedback. The psychological effect was enormous. Iraqi forces saw these drones and knew what followed. They called them eyes of death. The sustainment challenges of maintaining battleships in the 1980s were substantial and ultimately contributed to their final retirement. The steam propulsion plants were increasingly obsolete. Modern warships used gas turbines, more efficient, easier to maintain, requiring smaller crews. Finding sailors trained on steam systems was difficult. The Navy's steam training pipeline was shrinking as older ships retired. Each battleship reactivation required pulling instructors and experienced personnel from other assignments. The 16-inch gun ammunition presented even greater problems. The powder was manufactured in the 1930s and 1940s. Stored in controlled conditions, it remained usable for decades. But it was slowly deteriorating. Chemical analysis showed the powder was losing stability. It could still fire, but quality control was becoming problematic. Manufacturing new powder would require reopening production lines closed since 1945. The projectiles themselves were available in quantity. Thousands sat in storage. But powder was the limiting factor. The Navy started producing new 16-inch powder in the late 1980s. The estimates were sobering. It would cost tens of millions of dollars to recreate the manufacturing process. Quality control would require extensive testing. Safety certification would take years. For a weapon system with limited expected service life, the investment didn't make sense. The spare parts situation was equally challenging. Many components were no longer manufactured. The reduction gears in the propulsion system, certain electronic tubes in the older fire control systems, specialized boiler components. Navy maintainers became expert at fabricating parts that no longer existed. Machine shops aboard tenders would manufacture obsolete components from scratch. It worked, but it was expensive and time-consuming. The greatest challenge was strategic. What role did battleships serve in the post-Cold War world? The surface action group concept had been designed to counter Soviet naval power. With the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Navy rusting at its peers, the primary justification evaporated. Power projection ashore remained relevant. The Gulf War proved the value of naval gunfire support. But was it worth maintaining 4 battleships specifically for that role? The Navy's answer was no. Tomahawk missiles could be launched from dozens of platforms: cruisers, destroyers, submarines, attack aircraft. Distributing strike capabilities across the fleet was more flexible than concentrating them in a few battleships. Naval gunfire support could be provided by destroyers and cruisers with 5-inch guns, not as powerful as 16-inch certainly, but adequate for most missions, and far cheaper to maintain. The crew requirements were the final nail. In the drawdown following the Cold War, the Navy was reducing personnel. Each battleship required 1,500 sailors. Those sailors could man 5 modern surface combatants. From a fleet management perspective, the choice was clear. The romantic appeal of battleships couldn't overcome the cold mathematics of force structure. Better to have more ships with smaller crews than fewer ships requiring massive manning. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney announced the final decision in 1991. All 4 Iowa-class battleships would be decommissioned. The era of the American battleship was definitively over. There were attempts to save them. The Marine Corps lobbied hard for retention. Marines depend on naval gunfire support for amphibious operations. The 16-inch guns provided a capability nothing else could match. Some members of Congress proposed keeping at least 1 battleship in active service as a national asset. For ceremonial purposes, for presence missions, for contingencies. But the Navy was adamant. The costs were too high. The strategic rationale was gone. The ships would be retired. The only concession was the requirement to maintain 2 in ready reserve, theoretically capable of reactivation. This requirement lasted until 2006, when even this fig leaf was abandoned. The ships were too old, the systems too obsolete. Reactivation would be more expensive than building new vessels with equivalent capabilities. Iowa and Wisconsin were finally struck from the Naval Vessel Register. The requirement to maintain them in ready reserve was eliminated. All 4 ships were designated for donation as museum ships. This process took years. Museums had to be found willing to accept them. Preparation for donation required extensive work. Hazardous materials removed, classified equipment stripped, systems preserved for static display. Iowa became a museum in Los Angeles in 2012. New Jersey had already opened as a museum in 2001. Missouri, the most famous, was birthed at Pearl Harbor near the Arizona Memorial in 1999. Wisconsin opened as a museum in Norfolk in 2000. The museum ships serve multiple purposes. They're tourist attractions, certainly, educational platforms, memorials to the sailors who served aboard them. But they also represent something deeper, the end of an era, the final chapter of a story that began with HMS Dreadnought in 1906. For a century, battleships represented the ultimate expression of naval power. The biggest guns, the thickest armour, the most powerful engines, they were the capital ships, the flagships, the symbols of national might. Their battles became legend: Jutland, Guadalcanal, later Gulf. Their names inspired fear and respect: Bismarck, Yamato, Iowa. But technology moved on. Aircraft proved more flexible than guns. Missiles proved more accurate than shells. The submarines proved more deadly than surface ships. The battleship's advantages, armour and firepower, became less relevant. Its disadvantages, size and cost, became more prohibitive. The Iowa class represented the culmination of battleship development, the fastest, the most powerful, the most heavily armed battleships ever built by the United States. They were also the last. No nation will ever build battleships again. The military and economic circumstances that made them viable are gone forever. Modern anti-ship missiles can sink any surface target from beyond visual range. Building armour thick enough to withstand modern weapons would create ships too large and expensive to be practical. The same offensive capability can be achieved with missiles launched from smaller, cheaper platforms. The age of the gun-armed capital ship is over, yet something was lost when the last battleship decommissioned. A certain majesty, a visible symbol of power that missiles and jets don't provide. When a battleship appeared on the horizon, everyone knew it, friend and foe alike. There was no mistaking what it was or what it represented. The psychological impact of battleship presence cannot be quantified in spreadsheets or cost analyses, but it was real. Iraqi soldiers surrendering to a drone because they feared more bombardment. Lebanese militias pausing their artillery fire when New Jersey appeared offshore. North Korean supply convoys halting operations when an Iowa-class battleship was reported in the area. This presence, this intimidation factor, had value beyond the strictly military. It influenced decision-making, it shaped adversary calculations, it provided diplomatic leverage. Modern warships lack this visible presence. A destroyer looks much like a cruiser. A cruiser resembles a frigate. To untrained eyes, modern warships are interchangeable grey hulls. But a battleship was unmistakable. The massive hull, the towering superstructure, the enormous gun turrets. Everyone recognized a battleship. The debate continues among military historians and naval strategists. Should the Iowa class have been retired? Could they still serve a useful purpose? Would modern upgrades make them viable? The technological optimists argue that with modern engines, updated electronics, and new weapons, the basic hull could be transformed into a relevant 21st century warship. Replace the steam plant with gas turbines or diesel-electric. Remove the 16-inch guns and install vertical launch systems for missiles. Update all systems to current standards. You'd have a large, well-protected, heavily armed surface combatant. The realist counter that starting fresh would be cheaper and more effective than trying to modernize 80-year-old hulls. The Iowa class were designed around 1930s technology and 1940s requirements. Adapting them to modern standards would be prohibitively expensive. Better to design new ships from scratch, incorporating current technology and doctrine. The romantics simply miss the presence of battleships. The power, the history, the sheer impressiveness. They acknowledge the practical arguments but mourn the loss of something unique. All three perspectives have merit. The battleships really are obsolete by any objective measure, but they represented something beyond mere military capability. National power, naval tradition, American industrial might. These intangible factors matter, even if they don't appear in budget justifications. The legacy of the Iowa class extends beyond their direct military contributions. They influenced ship design. The emphasis on armor protection influenced later vessels. Modern warships may not have 16-inch belt armor, but they incorporate protection against missiles and shells. The concept of multi-role platforms traces back to the Iowa-class modernization. A ship that could launch cruise missiles, fire naval guns, and conduct anti-surface warfare. Today's destroyers and cruisers follow this model, combining multiple capabilities in single hulls. The importance of endurance and sustainability was demonstrated repeatedly. The Iowa class could remain on station for extended periods, conducting sustained operations. Modern ships emphasize this capability, with improved damage control, redundant systems, and extensive logistics support. The Pioneer drone operations pioneered unmanned aerial vehicle employment from surface ships. Today, dozens of naval vessels operate drones for reconnaissance, targeting, and surveillance. The concept proved aboard Missouri and Wisconsin in 1991 has become standard practice. Even the main battery contributed to future developments. While no one builds 16-inch guns anymore, the lessons learned from precision naval gunfire informed later systems. The emphasis on accuracy, rapid fire, and sustained bombardment influenced designs for modern naval guns. The 5-inch guns on current destroyers trace their doctrinal lineage to battleship employment. The human stories from Iowa-class service are perhaps the most enduring legacy. Thousands of sailors served aboard these ships across 5 decades. Their experiences spanned from World War II through the Gulf War. Veterans of Missouri's 1945 service met sailors who served during her 1991 deployment. 46 years separated their experiences, but both served on the same ship, walked the same decks, operated the same guns. Seaman First Class Eugene Gertsen served aboard Iowa during World War II. He was 19 years old when he watched the surrender ceremony aboard Missouri from Iowa's deck in Tokyo Bay. 66 years later, he visited Iowa as a museum ship in Los Angeles. He stood at his old battle station. He touched the 5-inch gun mount he had operated in combat. He wept. The ship hadn't changed, he had. But the connection remained. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Jenkins served aboard Wisconsin during her final deployment. She was a fire controlman, operating the systems that aimed the 16-inch guns. She watched through remote camera feeds as Wisconsin shells destroyed Iraqi positions. When Wisconsin decommissioned in 1991, Jenkins felt like she was losing a shipmate. These stories, multiplied across thousands of sailors, represent the real legacy of the Iowa class, not statistics or combat reports, but human experiences, the pride of serving aboard a capital ship, the camaraderie of large crews, the satisfaction of operating powerful weapons in defense of the nation. The technical specifications remain impressive even by modern standards. A length of 887 feet makes them longer than 3 football fields. The beam of 108 feet allowed passage through the Panama Canal with just feet to spare on each side. The draft of 38 feet meant they could operate in relatively shallow waters, crucial for shore bombardment missions. The propulsion system generated 212,000 shaft horsepower. This drove the ship to a top speed exceeding 33 knots, faster than many modern warships. The fuel capacity of over 8,000 tons of fuel oil provided a range exceeding 15,000 nautical miles at cruising speed. The armor protection totaled over 20,000 tons. The belt armor, turret faces, conning tower, and armored decks combined to create the most protected warships ever built by the United States. This armor could theoretically withstand hits from 16-inch armor-piercing shells at battle ranges. The main battery's 9 16-inch guns could each fire 2 rounds per minute in sustained combat. The maximum range exceeded 23 miles with special projectiles. Standard armor-piercing shells were effective to about 20 miles. High-capacity bombardment shells sacrificed some range for explosive effect. Each projectile contained approximately 150 pounds of explosive compound. The blast crater from a 16-inch shell measured 40 feet across and 15 feet deep. The concussion could kill unprotected personnel within a 100-foot radius. Buildings collapsed. Bunkers caved in. Earth fortifications disintegrated. The secondary battery in World War II configuration consisted of 25-inch guns capable of engaging surface or air targets. These weapons fired a 55-pound projectile to a range of 9 miles against surface targets or 37,000 feet altitude against aircraft. The rate of fire was up to 15 rounds per minute per gun. Later configurations reduced the 5-inch armament to provide space for missile systems, but even the modified ships retained 12 5-inch guns, enough for significant anti-aircraft and surface engagement capability. The ammunition storage and handling systems were marvels of mechanical engineering. The 16-inch shells were stored in magazines deep in the ship, below the waterline and behind armour. Hoists lifted them to the turrets. Rammers pushed them into the breeches. The powder bag, stored separately for safety, followed the same path. Each component had to be precisely timed and positioned. An error could jam the gun or, worse, cause an explosion within the turret. The worst peacetime disaster involving an Iowa-class battleship occurred on April 19, 1989. Iowa was conducting exercises in the Caribbean when an explosion ripped through the center 16-inch turret. Turret 2. 47 sailors died instantly. The explosion, later determined to be an accidental detonation of powder during loading, demonstrated the inherent danger of handling such powerful weapons. The investigation revealed the aging powder was more unstable than recognized. This tragedy contributed to the eventual decommissioning. If the powder was becoming dangerous, and new powder was prohibitively expensive, the ship's viability was questionable. The Iowa explosion cast a shadow over the final years of battleship service, a reminder that these weapons demanded constant respect and perfect procedures. The cost analysis of Iowa-class operations presents a complex picture. The initial construction costs during World War II were approximately $100 million per ship, equivalent to about $1.6 billion in current dollars. The 1980s modernization cost roughly $425 million per ship, about $1.1 billion in today's currency. Operating costs ran approximately $70 million annually per ship, in 1980s dollars, covering crew, fuel, maintenance, and ammunition. By comparison, a modern Arleigh Burke-class destroyer cost about $1.8 billion to build and roughly $50 million annually to operate. The destroyer has a crew of 300 versus 500 for a battleship. Per sailor, operating costs were comparable, but the absolute costs favoured smaller, more numerous ships. The strategic calculation came down to force structure. Would you rather have one battleship or 3 destroyers for the same personnel investment? Most naval planners chose the destroyers. More platforms meant more presence, more flexibility, more redundancy. If you lose a battleship, you've lost significant combat power. If you lose a destroyer, you still have the other 2. The concentration of capability in battleships was a vulnerability in the distributed operations envisioned for modern naval warfare. The international reaction to Iowa-class reactivation in the 1980s was mixed. Allied nations generally approved. The British, with their long battleship tradition, appreciated the historical continuity. The Japanese, former enemies who respected naval power, were impressed. The Australians, facing potential threats in the Pacific, welcomed increased American presence. Soviet reactions combined concern and dismissal. Officially, Soviet spokesmen claimed battleships were obsolete, relics of outdated thinking. Unofficially, Soviet naval planners worried. The Kirov-class battlecruisers were designed to counter American carrier groups. The Iowa-class presented a different problem. Their armour made them difficult to sink with missiles. Their guns outranged Soviet naval artillery. Their Tomahawk missiles added strategic strike capability. Soviet doctrine struggled to incorporate battleships into their threat assessments. Plans developed for engaging American carrier groups didn't apply to heavily armoured battleships. New tactics and weapons allocations were required. Regional powers noticed battleship deployments. When Missouri and Wisconsin deployed to the Persian Gulf, every nation with coastline on that body of water took note. Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the Gulf states, all recognized that the United States had deployed overwhelming naval power. The visible presence mattered. Smaller nations lack sophisticated intelligence capabilities. They can't track submarines or predict airstrikes, but they can see battleships. The message was clear and unmistakable. American power was present, visible, and ready to strike. The environmental considerations of battleship operations became increasingly relevant. The steam propulsion plants were oil-fired boilers, inherently less efficient than gas turbines. Fuel consumption was substantial, approximately 100 tons of fuel oil per day at economical cruising speed, far more in combat operations. The black smoke from the funnels during high-speed operations was visually impressive, but environmentally problematic. Modern warships produce much cleaner exhaust. The 16-inch guns generated their own pollution. Each shot produced enormous quantities of smoke and combustion byproducts, unburned powder residue, chemical compounds from the explosive. The blast effects themselves disrupted marine life for miles. Not a significant concern in wartime, but increasingly relevant for peacetime operations. Hazardous materials aboard included asbestos insulation throughout the ship, lead-based paint on many surfaces, polychlorinated biphenyls in electrical systems, mercury in various instruments. Preparing the ships for museum status required extensive hazmat remediation, adding to the cost of preservation. The alternative history question inevitably arises. What if the Iowa class had been retained? What if 1 or 2 were kept in service through the 2000s and 2010s? The Afghanistan and Iraq wars featured substantial ground combat requiring fire support. Could battleship gunfire have contributed? Proponents argue yes. The sustained bombardment capability would have been valuable. 16-inch shells striking Taliban positions in Afghan mountains. Missouri bombarding insurgent strongholds in Fallujah. The psychological impact alone would be significant. Critics note the practical problems. Afghanistan is landlocked. No coastline means no naval gunfire. Iraq has limited coastline. Much of the fighting occurred far inland, beyond the gun's range, and modern precision-guided munitions from aircraft could achieve the same effects with less expense and more flexibility. The debate is ultimately hypothetical. The ships were retired, the decision was made, history cannot be rerun. But the discussion reveals differing philosophies about naval power and military capability. Should you maintain unique capabilities even if their utility is limited? Or should you optimize for efficiency and flexibility? There's no objectively correct answer. It depends on strategic assumptions, budget realities, and institutional priorities. The Navy chose efficiency and flexibility. Whether that was correct will be debated by historians for decades. The museum preservation of Iowa-class battleships presents ongoing challenges. These are massive, complex ships requiring constant maintenance, even in static display. Rust is the eternal enemy. The steel hulls corrode in salt water. Paint protects, but paint requires renewal. Museum staffs constantly battle deterioration. Leaks develop. Systems degrade. Preservation is a never-ending process. Funding is perpetually inadequate. The museums operate as non-profits, depending on admissions, donations, and grants. Major preservation work costs millions. Dry docking a battleship for hull maintenance is enormously expensive. Most museums can't afford it without special fundraising campaigns. The ships are gradually deteriorating, not rapidly, but inexorably. Without consistent major investment, eventually they'll deteriorate beyond economical preservation. This raises uncomfortable questions. How long can these museums be maintained? Will future generations see Iowa-class battleships, or only photographs and memories? Some preservation advocates argue for federal funding. These ships are national treasures, historically significant educational resources. The government should support their preservation. Others counter that museum funding is a private responsibility. Taxpayer dollars shouldn't maintain museum ships when active fleet needs aren't fully funded. The debate continues while the ships rust. The symbolic importance transcends practical considerations. The Iowa-class battleships represent American industrial power and military capability. They were built during the greatest industrial mobilization in history. They served through the Cold War. They fought in multiple conflicts. They embodied national determination and technological prowess. When you stand on the deck of New Jersey or Missouri, you're standing where history happened. These aren't replicas or reconstructions. These are the actual ships, the same steel that withstood combat, the same guns that fired in anger, the same decks that sailors walked. That connection to history has value beyond tourism dollars or educational programs. It's a tangible link to the past, a reminder of sacrifice and achievement, a monument to the sailors who served. Ultimately, the question of whether the Iowa class still mattered was answered definitively. Yes, not as war-winning weapons, not as dominant capital ships, but as flexible platforms that provided unique capabilities when needed. They mattered in Korea, in Lebanon, in the Gulf War. They mattered because they adapted. They mattered because they combined old and new technologies. They mattered because sometimes brute force still has a place. The day the Iowa class proved they still mattered was actually many days across 5 decades. Each time they fired in combat, each time their presence deterred aggression, each time they demonstrated that written-off platforms can find new purpose. That's their legacy. Not dominance, but relevance. Not revolution, but evolution. Not the future, but a successful bridge between past and present. The thunder of those 16-inch guns has fallen silent, but the lessons they taught still echo. Sometimes the old ways still work, sometimes proven technologies still have value. Sometimes there's no substitute for overwhelming firepower. The Iowa-class battleships earned their place in history not by being perfect, but by being there when they were needed. That's all any weapon system can do. That's all any ship can achieve. Be ready, be capable, be present when the mission requires. The battleships were ready, they were capable, they were present. And in the end, that's why they mattered.